Welcome everyone to the Contemplating Christian. We've got an exciting topic, exciting dialogue for you guys here today. We've got our friend from Womb to Tomb Apologetics with us, and I'm going to let him kind of kick it off and introduce our topics for us today, what we're going to be talking about, and also who he is and what his channel is about. So, Womb, take it away.
Hey guys, I'm Womb to Tomb Apologetics, and my channel is about defending the conservative, Christian, and pro-life worldview and showing why it explains the world better than competing ideologies. So my goal is to make these sorts of observations and concepts accessible to the average person, and hopefully I'll be able to do a little bit of that today as we go through the rather deep subject of Aquinas' four laws. So today we'll be going over a paper by Samuel here on the right, and he wrote it all about this subject, on the four kinds of laws that Aquinas identifies in his Summa Theologiae or Summa Theologica. These are eternal law, natural law, divine law, and human law. We'll define those for you a little bit later, but that's our little intro for now. Thanks so much for having me on, guys.
Yeah, should be a good chat. So yeah, like I said, got a lot of deep waters to wade into here, and we'll try to both get into some good meaty topics, but then also bring it down to some practical things as well. But Samuel, you wrote this paper, so this is kind of your brainchild. How about you talk about the introduction to this, and maybe start off with kind of the ancients and the moderns and how they would think about just the concept of law in general. That's really broad, but take that where you want to take it.
Yeah, the overall thesis of the paper was actually just that Aquinas has this fourfold system of laws, but then each of those kinds of laws bind our conscience, and that if we abandon those laws, there are going to be consequences. And the paper does go over all four kinds of laws, but it focuses mainly on natural law. Because it seems like that one is the one that we have abandoned the most today in our culture. Okay, so actually gets started in like the first step as a prolegomena issue, or like just a precursor to actually diving into the four laws. I have a section on the ancients. That's what I call it. So just the ancient mind. And when I say ancients, I'm not talking about like ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. I'm more talking about like ancient Greeks and even people in Rome as well. So there are two big differences on how they thought about everything. Okay, the first is natural law. The second is the four causes. So for natural law, the big thing is that they believed that natural law connected us to the transcendent divine law. So even someone like Cicero, who wasn't necessarily part of he wasn't
the Christian
like
tradition.
a saint. Yeah, he wasn't a saint or anything like that. He still wrote and thought about these things, and he said that when we have our civil law and we have our divine law, there has to be something connecting the human law to the divine law, and he saw that as natural law, because that's what God imbued all of his, I guess, ethics and design into. And from there, we can derive what is right and wrong and then apply it to our civil government. And that natural law is basically covering everyone and everything. So it's holding everyone accountable in a way. And if you get rid of that, you suddenly break apart those two things. So that's the first thing. Second thing is the causes. And today we are obsessed with two out of the four causes. So the ancient mind and classical thinkers of antiquity, they thought if you were going to understand something or think rightly about something, like ourselves and laws and the moral act, you had to know all four causes. But today we're only concerned with two of them. The ones that we are obsessed with are the material and the efficient cause. So we only look into what things are made out of and what caused them. We don't necessarily look into their essence or their final end or purpose. And that will tie into everything.
Just going to say, to piggyback off that, I always think about an ancient versus a modern mind. Way back in the past, if a huge storm happened, the people would say the gods are angry at us, something like that. That would be a rational conclusion that people would draw. And as modern people, we might laugh at that and say, ha ha, ha, no, it's not. That's because the clouds are rubbing together and they create lightning. And that's kind of a good, I would say, a good perspective on how these mindsets are different. And we want to say that it's probably both, that there's both divine supernatural cause behind something like a storm. There's God's providence that guides that. And also there's scientific explanations. But to take one and leave the other is a mistake that the modern mind makes. So Samuel, I'd love it if you could briefly define Aquinas' 4 types of laws. If you could just kind of walk through each of those briefly, and then maybe even connect that original idea you had from Cicero, that kind of hierarchy of natural law connecting eternal and human law.
The types of laws that we have, it's not even specific to Aquinas. A lot of people use these distinctions. But the 4 types are quite simple. It's just there's the divine law, so the overarching moral law. Then we have natural law, which is basically everything has a teleology and a design, and we should follow those designs. And if we don't, it's seen as a bad thing, right? Then the third kind is civil law, which is just human law. So if we created a government and made rules, that's civil law. And then finally, it is biblical law. And when it comes to this discussion, the main thing is divine, natural, and civil, because those are all connected in like a streamline area. The reason biblical law is a little bit different is because that is divinely revealed to us through sacred scripture. And it just is, it's kind of in like a different category. It's not necessarily in that direct connection between the divine and civil of like the natural connecting it. That's what I'd give for a brief definition of each law. Do either of you have anything to add to those definitions?
No, I just think it's helpful to just go through. We see, different examples of this in Scripture. Like in human law, we see 1 Peter and all over the place. Romans 13, you could go, Christians are exhorted to obey the governing authorities, things like that. And natural law, Romans 1 is a classic passage, just to give kind of handles for people to grasp onto from Scripture. People are held accountable for God's law that's revealed in nature. There's the divine law, be like the 10 Commandments. And you cite Psalm 18 as an eternal law. Do you mean maybe Psalm 19? The divine versus the eternal law.
Yeah, 9 through 11. That's what I use. But when I say eternal law and divine law, they're synonymous. It's not necessarily me making a distinction.
Very good. And then you talk about how there's a hierarchy here, and natural law fits in the middle and connects us to the transcendent. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
The connection between the divine and civil law is natural law. I mean, it's kind of what I mentioned before with Cicero. They just believe that like there is an eternal law grounded in God, but there's really no way for us to access that, right? If there isn't a natural law. So if God did not imbue creation with everything, like what are we supposed to use to figure out things, right? And in this case, we're talking about people without scripture, by the way. So someone could have scripture and just be like, yeah, I have it right here. All right, we aren't talking about those people. We are talking about just like people who really aren't Christian, who haven't heard of this stuff.
Like an Aboriginal living on an island. He doesn't have the Bible, but he can still glean basic moral truths from observing the natures of things around him. God imbues his eternal law into nature, creating natural law, which we in turn can discover even without divine law.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we would call natural law and say that's the need for natural law. But the moment we take that away, somehow now people don't have a way to observe or abstract or figure out what the moral law is if we take away the idea that God put it into this world in nature.
So we need all of them is what you're getting at, and that they're all important, that we need them, and that, and we're going to get into this more, but that we've often, I think in the modern world, abandoned natural law. And there's actually even groups of Christians that abandon the natural law to various degrees, and they run into trouble with that, I think. And so we'll talk about it both as it's important for everyone but Christians too, in a robust defense of all of God's revelation, to be able to, there's different ways Christians talk about what natural law is, but being able to appeal to God's revelation in nature to defend the Christian worldview is important.
Yeah, and I suppose before we actually move past the definitions of the laws, we can talk about two controversial areas in the laws, because most of them is agreed upon, but then there are two controversial ones, and you guys can speak to it from your prospective backgrounds and everything like that. But the first one is biblical law and how to break that down. So we are going to be talking about biblical law in this and how it binds the conscience and everything like that. But that is going to be different based upon how we break down biblical law. So how I'd break it down is we obviously have the Old and New Testament, but also in the Bible we have ceremonial law, which is used for like religious rites and stuff. We have the moral law in the Bible, the overarching right and wrong. And then we also have the judicial law of like ancient Israel that governs their country. So what do you think about that breakdown? Do you guys agree with that? Would you add anything? Would you break it down differently?
Yeah, well, that's good insight there. I would say I'm most familiar with those designations when it comes to responding to that age-old question from atheists and other unbelievers. Why do Christians eat shellfish and wear mixed fabrics? But that's Old Testament ceremonial and Israelite civil law. And those categories don't carry over to Christians today, but moral law does. That's things like don't murder. So that's more of an apologetic answer that my audience might be more familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just in general, I'd agree, and I think that the threefold distinction of the law that you laid out is helpful. It's helpful to kind of break down mentally what these laws are, but I think I would also just connect it to the biblical covenants and the unfolding of biblical covenants. So I would say we're no longer, the reason why we don't obey all 613 commandments in the Old Testament is because we're no longer under the Mosaic covenant as a covenant. And so we see it more as put it in the category of wisdom that we can think about and draw from in terms of making laws today. But today we're under the new covenant, so we're under the law of Christ. And so there's some differences at how I'd cash it out there, but there's some general agreement, I think, between us.
Yeah. Okay. Last controversial one. This one is actually more controversial before we can get into how everything is binding our conscience. With human law, when I was studying this, I found that Aquinas actually put human tradition under civil law, if I remember correctly. So he said that if we have a tradition, that is actually something that can bind our conscience. It is a type of human law that is part of all of this. So like tradition isn't just like an opinion of someone from the past. It's not just a random thing we do every day, but he actually says it's a law. So what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think we can see some different Protestant and Catholic views here a bit, and Aquinas is different too, just because he has, he's in a period where the church and state relations are different too, so that kind of complicates matters. So he sees, church tradition has a different sense of authority for him, not just because he's, a medieval Roman Catholic, but also because the church and the state are kind of they're in a different way than they are now. It's not like America. And so there's more of a merging there, perhaps. And so I would see it as there is a binding authority that tradition has, even for Christians, even for Protestant Christians, but they would still cash it out as something that's subordinate to Scripture and potentially correctable. So we would see that just because something's an authority or that something binds the conscience doesn't mean it has to be infallible. You can still have an authority that's real.
Yeah.
Yeah. William, anything on that?
Yeah, I would concur with that. I think you covered most of it. Like you say, keep in mind the historical context with the commingling of God and government in this large theocratic state versus a God underpinned but more separated version in the American system. And of course, there's the Catholic Protestant debate over authority. Protestants obey authorities, of course, but which authorities are infallible and which ones are fallible? So good job.
Those are all the definitions and precursing ideas.
So do you want to go into each of these laws in particular now and like the biblical evidence and go more into the conscience?
I'd like to hear what you guys think about each of this, but what I found and what I think is that in the Bible, each of these things that I've laid out is described as being able to bind the conscience. So before actually going over the obligations of the philosophical reasons that can convince someone outside of the Christian tradition, I think Christians, just by looking at Scripture, should be bound by Scripture itself to believe that every kind of law binds our conscience. Because some people will say, "Oh, we don't need to follow natural law anymore. It doesn't apply to me," or they might say certain things about human law or the moral law or biblical law or something like that. For the biblical evidence, I guess we can start with human law. We get places in like First Peter that tells us to submit to the government. Now, we can get into exactly how that works, but in general, like there is biblical evidence telling us to submit to the government, meaning that if we are supposed to submit to it, that it is binding to us, and if we disobey that, it is wrong.
Yeah, and what you're getting at is that there's biblical evidence for each of these types of laws, and that each of them bind the conscience, meaning that we are morally obligated to follow. And you see that in human law in 1 Peter and Romans 13 and other places. Natural law, we see multiple places where we're held account to God's design in the world and how that binds us, that we're be held accountable for how we respond to that revelation, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
William, anything else there that you can think of from Scripture that relates to that?
Yeah, most of my commentary will be in the upcoming sections, but when you think about what's binding our conscience in the Bible, I think of Paul saying that the natural law is written on our hearts and that everyone is without excuse for not believing in God, but that's still on the same note.
Yeah, we can get into that because that is the controversial one. Because if you go into the Bible, we have like the biblical law. No one's really gonna argue it being in the Bible, but there's the eternal law that talks about God's moral law just enduring and enlightening everything and basically being above everyone and obligating everyone, right? So just that overall arching moral law. But here's the controversial one. It is natural law. So in Romans 1, it says they were held to a standard, and Paul says that they were held to the standard by the things in creation. And I would say that's the number one proof text for the natural law actually binding the conscience. I would love for someone to try and like play devil's advocate and like reason through it, because I mean today we in our culture we see a lot of people that try and like push Romans 1 away. They're like, oh no, that's not a thing, because I mean Romans 1 talks about some controversial issues like people being given over to their desires, like the LGBTQ community and everything like that. That's what it would be connecting to. And so a lot of people want to try and push it away and say, no, it's actually not talking about that.
Right. And Paul just kind of appeals to these things as kind of self-evident truths that are obvious that we're going to be held accountable for. The way I like to think about it is God's natural revelation. It's kind of how I like to speak about it. But God's natural revelation helps make sense of the special revelation we see in Scripture. So we might have I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on this too. We might have a law that says homosexuality is wrong, but then we can give many answers to why it's wrong from Scripture. We can give passages of Scripture, but then we can also appeal to things in nature that testify to the immorality of that action, things like that, or abortion, or a number of different issues. So we have both natural law as support and help in that, in defending the worldview, and also direct revelation from Scripture.
Yeah, good analysis, Will. I look at it like this. God imbues the purpose he has for things into their very natures, and so that's why natural law makes certain parts of morality more obvious for us. Like, what is the purpose or the end, or if you want to use a fancy word, the telos of something? What is it supposed to be used for? Obviously, when you bring up homosexuality, that's regarding the sexual act, but it goes into a whole lot of other things too. But our answer to that question is very controversial in our culture, because People do not want to acknowledge that things have a purpose, that there is a design, that there is a way something ought to be used and it ought not to be used. Our culture prefers to spectrify everything. Sexuality is on a spectrum. There isn't a right and a wrong, there isn't an ought and an ought not. There is only whatever I want it to be used for. You make your own purpose for things. So that is definitely a rejection of natural law theory within our own culture.
Yeah, totally. And even what Samuel was getting at in the beginning about a loss of final causality. So if we don't believe that there's any end goal or purpose or final cause to, say, the sexual act, something like that, like the procreation of children and the union and marriage, things like that. If we reject those things, then we will reject all the oughts and ought nots of a particular action.
One thing to know before we get into the qualities of obligation is this. When we're talking about the conscience, we aren't just talking about knowing what's right. The conscience, we would say, is part of, like, it's an act of your soul, I suppose, because it is actually doing something to you and influencing you. Because a lot of people just think your conscience is something that influences your mind and just like tells you what's right and wrong. That's not it. It influences your will because your conscience can persuade you to do something or to not do something, and can either make you do an action or not do an action. So it's actually part of your will. That's the first thing we're talking about when we're actually talking about it binding the conscience. But we can actually get into the criteria for obligation. And again, I would love for your thoughts on each of these things, and maybe even someone to play a little devil's advocate and try and come up with reasons for why it like wouldn't work. But for everyone out there, for all four kinds of laws, they would have these reasons for why they are binding onto us. So when we're talking about something that is binding us, we would talk about one, that there are what I put under reasons for action. As in, if someone does something bad, there are people who punish that thing, or if they do something good, they would reward that thing. So if we have the idea of benefits or punishment, that shows that it was obligating. Another one, it could be overriding. It can override our desires. And basically, like, we can want to do something, but then it suddenly makes us not want to do that anymore. So it overrides it. Another one is objectivity. It's grounded in universal principles. So universality, it's everywhere. Another is knowledge. People are just aware of it. And then we have lack of deliberation, which is like people just recognize it. You kind of don't need to justify it further. And then the last one, I actually think it's the best one, the presence of blame. If someone does something and people start blaming each other, that shows that it was morally obligating, because you wouldn't try and blame someone for something that nobody was bound to, right?
Yeah.
And that reminds me of C.S. Lewis, because in his Beginning of Mere Christianity, he basically says, like, we all act like there's some kind of moral law, and that's what a lot of these qualities point at. Is just, if we break a rule, the other person expects us to know that rule and then tells us that we're breaking that rule,
Mhm. Right. I kind of think of it as like 8 different ways at looking at, or like kind of looking at from different angles, just the moral conscience within us, and all these different kind of angles of our inner man testifying that this is a right or wrong action, that sort of a thing. That's how it strikes me.
You said that you wanted someone to play devil's advocate for you?
Oh yeah, that'd be awesome.
I'll give it my best shot, but I don't know if this is quite what you're looking for, but we'll see. I would just say maybe our culture would, I wouldn't say necessarily disagree with it, but they might try to limit these sorts of things. So, objectivity. I would say if you asked a Christian versus a non-believer, a secularist, the secular person is probably going to say that there's a lot less objective in our world than the Christian would say. So again, they might not reject that there's objectivity, but they might try to subjectify a lot more things. So I don't know what you would think about that. But then there's also the idea of universality versus what we might call multiculturalism. Again, coming back to, are things really objective and universal? Or can we make our own morality? And then knowledge. How do we know something? Is it given to us by God? Is it sort of imprinted upon our soul by God? Or is it something we can just make up? It's just socially constructed. How much do we hear that in our culture? It's just a social construct. The family is a social construct. Marriage is a social construct. It's not designed by God. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Those three. That's those are the ones that like a secularist would attack. So objectivity, universality, and then also knowledge. Yeah, I mean, for knowledge, it can just simply be like you've heard the law before or something like that, or you're aware that there is one. But secularists would probably just focus on human law. But for the objectivity and universality, that one's more interesting. So I want to dive into that one. For that, I would actually say we aren't talking about morals themselves. We're talking about it binding the conscience, or just things binding the conscience. And so those actually are required for obligation. So I would say the secularists can't act like if they don't agree with objectivity and universality, they can't require that people were obligated to a certain thing. Because if you start talking with someone, we say it's not a subjective preference, as in like if there's a law and it is a subjective preference, no one would say that your opinion is binding upon me, right? I mean, unless you just want to be right and like bully me or something like that. But like if you just say, oh, I think chocolate ice cream is the best, that isn't binding on me because it's subjective, right? If you don't have objectivity, you don't have an obligation to follow that thing, right? And that's the problem, because when you start getting into morals, so a lot of people bring up like, oh, if I murdered someone, is that objectively wrong? And secularists would be like, oh, no, it's everything is subjective. But the moment it becomes subjective, I don't have to follow the rule, right? Because it's subjective. And they have a hard time telling someone that they are doing something wrong because they believe in subjectivity. So I guess it's kind of like a take it or leave it kind of thing. If you leave it, you have to allow for everyone to live how they want, no matter what. But if you take it, then you can actually bind people.
Yeah, maybe I can give an example of what a secular person might use to push back. And I think I know where the hole in this is, but I'll let you cover that. Let's say the government made a law tomorrow that said you have to use the pronouns that people identify with. So here you might have reasons for following that. For example, there's a punishment. It might override your personal desires. I don't want to do this, but it's the law. Objectivity, that's probably one of the holes, but you could possibly say it's an objective truth that you have to respect how someone identifies himself. Universal, probably another hole, but you would have knowledge, you would know about the law, therefore you have accountability. It would be socially accepted, so there's a lack of deliberation too, and of course there would be blame involved there. So what would you think about that?
Well, you want to give it a shot, and then I'll give my opinion.
Well, I think the reason it's a matter of controversy is because for a Christian, they see it as meeting some of the criterias of obligation here. Of course, they're not thinking of your 8 criterias, but there are some things that are met. So like it's being mandated by a governing authority. So then there's a conflict of interest of, do I obey the governing authority, or do I obey what I think God would want me to do by not lying? That sort of a thing. And so that's why these are controversial things. What do we do with pronouns? What do we do with church during COVID? All these sorts of things when governing authorities kind of interplay with what I should be doing. So the reason that the example you give is interesting is because it's a governing authority that's mandating something, which actually makes it a difficult conundrum that you have to actually think about and go, okay, well, why do I disobey? I need to have a good reason to disobey a governing authority as a Christian.
Hmm.
But I think
Yeah.
there is good reason, because you'd be lying. And so that'd be,
And when you say the good reason is because you'd be lying, that's because these four types of law have a hierarchy. That means that every law we make should align with the higher laws. The eternal law is God's plan, natural law is how we participate in that plan, and human law ought to be consistent with that. Our human laws should be ordered toward what God tells us is right. So if you have a human law inconsistent with that, such as the one I just gave, Aquinas would say that's no law at all, because it's not abiding by the common goods of truth, goodness, and so on.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There is a hierarchy, and that was actually going to be my response. So, like, all of this, like, moral obligation, objectivity, all of that, it's resting on the foundation that we went over at the beginning of this talk with Cicero and his hierarchy that also later Christian tradition picked up, where it's literally divine laws at the top, natural law, and civil law. And there are reasons to that hierarchy, and so that means there are exceptions. The hierarchy is structured in order of importance. It's first like the divine law, then natural law, then you have some civil law. And the natural law is what they say should be guiding the civil authorities. And your question was tricky, because you're right. If a government did say that, it would hit the marks of obligation. But then you get like into all this mess of, what if I'm obligated to two things or multiple things, and then they're telling me to do different things? Which one do I follow? And I think the really only answer is you follow the more important one. I think that is the only answer, because at that point, another answer might be like, oh, you just follow whichever one you want, or something like that,
Yeah.
or whichever one you're feeling. But
Yeah.
then that would reduce to subjectivism and just whatever you want, and there wouldn't be objective markers.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That almost gets me into the trickiness. That almost makes me think of the trickiness that we get into in even basic ethics, like in utilitarianism.
Mhm.
I should never murder someone, but what if I have to murder someone to stop a bomb from going off in Manhattan? How do we order what is most important? And I think it also highlights why we need a God, because God is not only the ultimate authority, but an incorruptible one. Hence why we put "In God We Trust" on our money, and we have "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. Hierarchy is essential.
Yeah, just going off that, I think, to add to what you're saying, the reason that we can say something like this authority or this law is more important than this one is because God is the one who grants the authority to all human authorities. So every human authority is derivative. It's derivative of God, who is the ultimate authority. And so a governing authority, like Jesus says to Pilate, Pilate says, I have authority to crucify you. Don't you want to respond to me? And Jesus just says, you have nothing except what is given to you from above, which is just the most boss thing to say ever when you're about to die. But
Yeah.
it's true. It's a derivative authority. And just like any parental authority, a parental authority is a derivative authority. That means it can be trumped. So if a parent is, beating their kid, abusing their kid, their authority is revoked in a sense. And then the state takes over.
Mhm.
And vice versa. These are derivative authorities, and God is the ultimate one who's giving this authority to all these secondary authorities. That's why we can say we obey God rather than men.
Mhm.
Yeah,
And
exactly, exactly. And like I said, in the American context, the God over government idea, stamped on every coin, printed on every paper bill, added into our Pledge of Allegiance, is so important. You must have him at the top of the hierarchy, so that the one who has care of the community at the human level is subject to the perfect caretaker. Humans strive to be good, but we hear power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. We know as Christians only the first clause of that is true, because the entity that literally has absolute power is incorruptible, because he is the definition of truth, goodness, and justice. The President of the United States, the most powerful man in the universe, is still underneath the command of the incorruptible heavenly power.
And what we would say is this: natural law is so important because, again, not everyone has like the Bible with just the list of morals. So the civil authorities and like being able to trump that, it used to be that natural law trumped that, and that's what civil law was derived from. So, just this idea of, oh, this government law isn't sending everyone towards the common good of all man, or this law isn't following our end as human beings, or something like that. That's what would trump the civil law in these cases. But when you get rid of that, civil law is no longer derived from anything, but just stands by itself,
Yeah.
which means nothing can trump it.
Yeah, I think to kind of sum up a little bit of what we've been discussing, we've got this eternal law, natural law, and human law, that these are three essential things that we need to hold to. We can't reject any of them, that they are all binding on our conscience. And thus, any rejection of them leads to disastrous consequences. And I thought we'd get into a little bit more of that, some practical things, cultural analysis, perhaps. If I ask both of you to kind of describe what you think some effects are of rejecting, let's say natural law is the one we've rejected. We've kind of rejected all three of them, but talk about the rejection of natural law in the modern world and how that has led to problems.
We can talk about the consequences of rejecting each one because they all have their unique stuff. There is definitely some overlap. But I would say the main one that has the biggest consequences is actually natural law. So, for example, kind of like what I just mentioned, the moment you get rid of natural law, the civil law has nothing it's derived from. So it'll just become basically do whatever you want, and that's the highest authority, right? You would start getting into subjectivism, nominalism, and just all these ideas of just people actually abandoning law in general because it's not derived from anything. It's just at that point, it's just human beings coming up with it, right? There's nothing guiding it or ordering it or anything like that. So I would say we would lose moral principles. We would also lose practical rationality because this idea of the natural law, I would also call that like our common sense. If we abandoned our common sense, we wouldn't have, like, obviously we wouldn't have that anymore. And that's led us to some pretty horrible things that for a long time people would have just been like, hey, it's kind of just like plain to you that we shouldn't do that, something like allowing kids to surgically change their gender or something. If you go back 50 years, everyone, like literally everyone, probably would have just been like, yeah, never do that, it's pretty clear. And if you even suggested it, you would have been just scolded at and like a social outcast.
I'd say since eternal law is God's plan for the universe, to abandon that is to abandon your purpose, because that's ultimately designated by God. That leads to nihilism and subjectivism, as you said. I make my own purpose. And I think that's why we see so many people lost and broken in our society. Regarding natural law, I would talk about the church and the world. So, in the church, some Protestants have trouble condemning certain things, like, say, masturbation, which isn't explicitly condemned in the Bible. And that's because they're so concerned with divine law because of sola scriptura that they fail to utilize or fully recognize natural law. Among the world, things get way worse. The whole LGBT movement is the epitome of rejecting natural law. All the sex stuff in our culture is perversion and thwarting of the natural ends of our bodies and the sexual act. We carve ourselves up to look like the opposite sex. We pursue same-sex relations, etc. This isn't the design God has for us. So we've seen the gradual erosion of the upper three kinds of law being represented in human law over the past few decades. Think Lawrence v. Texas, Obergefell v. Hodges, and I think you see some of these ideas being reflected in politics today. Today's politics is dominated by Marxist thinking where law is just about accruing power. But Aquinas saw law as subject to rationality, which is why there's so much disorder and inconsistency in worldly thinking. It's based on what I want to enforce as truth rather than what is actually truth. You might remember the question from a few years ago, what is a woman? Why was that spreading? To expose how leaving something open to be defined however we want it to be leaves us with no definition at all. And that further exacerbates the problem the world is trying to solve. I will put my identity and purpose into womanhood, but I don't even know what that is. Therefore, I don't have an identity or purpose. We instead should put our identity and purpose in what God says about us, even if it's not fun in the short term. That's the story of the garden. I'll create my own laws apart from God, but that just leads to sin and death and despair.
Yeah. You actually just, when you mentioned the eternal law, so all that was great on natural law. I 100% agree. But when you mentioned eternal law, that actually made me think of something. If you abandon the eternal law, so when I say that, I mean just like the overarching moral law grounded in God, so that like divine law at the top, what you get is you disconnect everything. Because if you take away the top dog, the rest of it falls apart. It doesn't matter. And the reason is because natural law doesn't have agency. It's not like a person that can like choose what's right and wrong or decide what's right and wrong, or even establish that. So if someone, let's say someone didn't believe in God, but still believed that there was like natural law, well, at that point, everything that like natural law says to be good or bad is just arbitrary, because then you can start asking, okay, if natural law says we should act this way, why is it that way? Who established that? Or you can, you can start thinking about things like that. I remember listening to a debate with William Lane Craig once, and he was debating a Platonist. And Platonists, or like people who follow Plato, they do believe in like an abstract realm that like of the forms, and that would help with that would connect to natural law and ethics and everything like that. But he said, because there's like no personhood, like, or agency, kind of like we have with God, all of the so-called rules are just arbitrary. They're just random at that point. Like,
Hmm.
And so even if you had someone who believed in all the laws except for the eternal law, it just still wouldn't work, because if you take away the top authority, it still all falls apart.
Absolutely. And if I may, I'll just make a few comments on divine law and human law. So, divine law, if you rejected that, that's just called not being a Christian, not following the Bible. You're rejecting uh, the scriptures. And then human law, generally our society keeps itself together, but we've seen a lot of distrust of government recently. We can even talk about examples of that on both sides of the political spectrum. So look at those right-wingers trying to overthrow the government on January 6th. They don't trust the government. Or look at the left-wingers with the BLM riots. They don't trust the police to govern them appropriately. And what that ultimately gets us to is a slow trend toward anarchy and self-rule, thinking that we can do it by ourselves. And Samuel, you even mentioned in your paper that that attitude results in potent individualism. And we see that all the time, even in conversations with everyday people about moral topics. If you watch people do apologetics on abortion, for example, as I've done, what does the other side say all the time? Why do you care so much? How is it your business? And in a more blunt sense, that's basically just saying, it's wrong to be a caring person. The answer to why do you care so much is because I'm a caring person. I take an interest in the things you're doing because they affect you and others around you that you hurt. Your behavior is not isolated to you, but our culture wants us to plug our ears and say that all my actions just affect me. But that's not true. So.
Yeah. Will, would you like to give some thoughts, and then I can do a final thought, and then we can kind of finish up?
Yeah, that'd be good. No, I was just going to say part of what you were saying is that we're not, like you're saying, you're not throwing off law altogether, but you're making yourself the law. And so often today in culture, it is not, we just reject all law. We just make our desire the law or something like that, or whatever we most want as the law of ourselves. The law of society is just our own self-expression, which is a dangerous thing. So that's it, brother.
Yeah. Yeah. And then for that, I just have two things, one on natural law and then one on human law. So a lot of people might think that, like, since we're Christians, we're just kind of like bashing secularism or something like that. But I also just want to clarify that Christians, a lot of Christians have also abandoned natural law. They kind of stop thinking that. And they abandon it because they have the Bible. They say, hey, this is, I have scripture, which obviously gives us a lot of the moral law, but also scripture doesn't talk on quite a few topics. And what people used to do is, if it didn't talk on a topic, they used to be able to say that the natural law could bind us and teach us about that. So I guess an example could be like contraception, or even a or something like that. So the Bible doesn't necessarily mention that, but people used to be able to say, like, oh yeah, you can kind of argue from natural law about whether that's good or not, right? And if you abandon that, it suddenly also just becomes like, oh, there isn't a right answer. We can't figure it out because the Bible doesn't say anything on it, or anything like that. So I do want to say that it still affects Christians as well. Maybe not as much as secularists, because Christians do have biblical law, but there's that. And then the last thing I wanted to say is, when it comes to the civil law, I would say the biggest thing that we get when we abandon civil law is, well, yeah, there's obviously anarchy, but we actually lose moral and virtuous characters. And what I mean by that is, civil law is actually, it functions as a pedagogical tool, as a teaching tool. The civil authorities are supposed to use the laws and punishments and everything like that to actually teach us and cultivate a culture that is virtuous. And so if you abandon civil law, you no longer have that tool that cultivates good human character.
Yeah, that's a good point, that there's a virtue formation inherent in these laws that God's designed for us. So it's a good for us to submit to good authorities. That forms good virtue in us. It's an important thing to I think, to kind of close this thing out, that there is great personal cost in abandoning these laws, not only for us but for society. And so we should seek to not throw them off.
Yeah. That's all I got. I mean, we kind of hit a bunch of the big topics. I mean, we could probably keep going, but we're kind of running out of time. So do you have any final words or thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say that this has been a great talk. Thanks for having me on. But I would say ultimately that, bringing it back to the story of the Bible, if you want purpose in your life, even some secularists and atheists have admitted that there's a God-shaped hole in all of us. And that's not wrong. That's something that maybe if you're on the edge, you should consider. If you're looking for direction in your life, go and investigate it. Thanks so much for having me on, guys. I really appreciate it. You can find me on YouTube at Womb to Tomb Apologetics, and these guys at The Contemplating Christian.
Yeah. All right.
Yes, we encourage y'all to check Womb's channel out, and we can link that in the description as well. And this has been a dialogue for The Contemplating Christian. We will see you guys next time.
Yeah, see you around.
If you liked this video, you'll enjoy these ones too. Like and subscribe for more.